Hello and welcome, this is Philip. Today, we're gonna make some freaking art. So for today's video, I wanted to remake an older drawing from 15 years ago. And in particular, this drawing is what I'm talking about. And I wanted to showcase how I would go about doing that with the knowledge that I have right now, and just showcase my thought process in general. So without further ado, let's do this. So first things first, the first thing I like to do is sketch things out. Fortunately, we already have like a design and general idea to work with. So in terms of design, we don't have to really think too hard about it. But in terms of starting things out, I like to sketch. What I mean by sketch is not focusing about details or perfect line work. We have a lot of wiggle room and time to make mistakes and just figure out the idea. So for me, the sketch is actually just to figure out the general idea before I get to my good-looking line art. I'm going to make my line art as soon as I figure out the idea through my sketch. So I'm just figuring things out. In this sketching phase, I allow myself to make errors, and I'm not gonna make 100% good gestures, or right now I'm just using whatever I can to make the pose as believable as I can. And then I refine my line art and add details so that I can use my line art afterwards as a base, as a foundation for my colors, and then paint over it. So let's take a step back and see what we got so far. And so let's see what kind of changes we made and why we did it. So he's kind of different from how I started off initially, right? So this is why we sketch. So the sketch is purely mainly to figure out an idea. And that idea is not the end all be all. I really wanted to make him more beast-like. So what I did is I enlarged his head and I shortened the proportions to make it less man-like, less human-like. And also the way he was squatting with his leg was all very similar to a human. What I wanted to do is shorten the proportions, change the legs a little bit, change the proportions and anatomy to make it look more beast-like. And now I feel like the idea is more congruent, because the idea of like this Raymond fiend beast minion is more solid right now. Naturally, the next step that I do is isolate it, fill it in with a solid color so I have the silhouette, and then add all the local colors, or just add some colors here and there to define how the character is going to look like. Then I work on a very rudimentary state of the background. I see it the same way as I see it making a character. In the first sketch phase, I just really make it as simple as possible, just to get the general idea of the background. And once I have the general idea, I go back to the character, because the idea of the background is already there, the mood and stuff like that. So there are two ways that I can go when I go paint over this, and there are two ways that I can go about it. In my previous video, I showcased how I added textures and photos and to make it more realistic looking and really amp up the detail level of your painting. It depends on what kind of result that I want. If I wanted more of a game art feel, a more fun and vibrant look, I would go for completely painterly style, and I would just completely paint the whole thing. But now I really wanted to make something more grim, more dark, and I felt like adding like a little bit more realistic details to it would be the right move. So I just added more textures, and now we're just adding textures so that later on we can paint over it. Now just go in and paint in the muscle definition. And for his arm, it's like, I envision it like very low body fat arm, you know, when you see these bodybuilder arms that have really like low fat percentage, you can see there's very specific muscle definition in them, and that's kind of the feel that I go for. Now I felt that the initial color was kind of red, so I desaturated and made it blue to fit it more into the atmosphere and the world he's living in. Now one thing I think is important to mention during my painting over and painting of the character is one thing that I keep in mind a lot is values. Values is so important because it can make literally the hugest difference just because the viewer can actually see what's going on. So this is a huge example I wanted to show. So if we go back a few steps, in its most rudimentary state, the painting is already visible, and so already in this state I want to make everything as readable as possible, and that I keep values in mind. And of course it helps that everything is kind of monochromatic, but even in color I make sure I change it into grayscale and check the values of my darks and lights, so everything is contrasted enough so you can actually see what's going on. You can actually see every element that you want to show. So our focal point is our character. So because naturally the background is going to be light, and because of the moon there's going to be shining a light at the back, naturally it's going to contrast against our character, right? Our character is going to be dark, and it's going to form a nice contrast against the light background. And also the trees in the back have a nice silhouette against the moonlight, and all these things are taking into account values into account, right? I feel like everything should be very clear and very readable. A very huge example of mine and a very huge inspiration of mine is Dark Souls. I feel like the star of the whole game is lighting. If you look at Dark Souls, to create this beautiful grim world, they use lighting more than anything. A lot of Dark Souls environments are pretty desaturated and pretty much really gray, and the lighting of like these warm torches, the sky lighting, some fog atmosphere, casted or reflective lighting, all make a huge difference to make this really beautiful atmosphere. And that's also one thing that I'm really inspired to do in this piece as well. Even though everything is pretty dark and monochromatic, pretty low in saturation, I let the lighting speak to really make everything readable. Now, as you can see, I'm pretty much just painting over everything, and I'm just creating all the necessary detail there is, just removing all the photo textures that is left over, and just creating all the details. I'm just putting as much detail by painting it in as I can. So yeah, and I paint over until I'm finished, until I think there's enough detail. Painting in the deep muscle definition in the legs. So when I paint the muscle definition in his legs, for example, of course I take into account the necessary muscle groups, I take into account the quads, but one thing I do, what I think could be interesting, is I purposely mess it up a little bit. Now you could make a counter argument against it, but for me, from my perspective, I like to mess it up a little bit just to create a little bit more of a weirdness into the anatomy. It's just very subtle, but I add a little bit of weirdness into the anatomy that unconsciously you're just gonna pick it up and see that this creature looks a little bit off, and it just gives that uncomfortable vibe to the viewer, and that's exactly what I want. So of course I take into account the correct muscle groups, but I mess it up a little bit. So once I feel like I defined the character pretty much, what I really like to do is add some fog. So if you take a look at the Photoshop file, as soon as I add the fog, you can see how like parts of his wing is pushed more to the depth, areas around his tail, for example, and that can really create like things that are pushed more to the foreground and things that go to the background. I really like to do that so you can really integrate your character in the world he's living in. After I've done that, my favorite thing to do is add a rim light, or at least an indication of the secondary light or the light that is coming from the back, and that is actually hitting our character, and that's gonna really make our character pop out more, or emphasize that moonlight effect even more, which makes it, in my opinion, just makes it look better and further integrate our character into the world he's living in. And all these things adding up just really feel like the whole painting as a whole works together. Then I just add all the details necessary, because after I paint out and define the muscles and I define everything by painting it in, I still find sometimes that it looks too smooth because I add paint strokes and I smudge it, paint stroke and I smudge it, and sometimes you end up with very smooth surfaces. So as you can see, what I'm doing now, I'm just really defining little bits and disconnected tissues of his skin, just to add that extra uncomfortableness of the character. And now, of course, no arm is complete without veins. All arms are going to show veins. Of course, if you add a lot of veins in a muscular arm, that's gonna make it more, you know, that's that extra detail level that I think is necessary. So if I create all the details on the smooth surfaces, I feel like I'm content with the result of our character. And then I work on the background. I further finish the idea, and the keyword is I just keep it in an idea, and then what I do afterwards, I add textures again. I do it the same way as I did with my character, and then I paint over the whole thing, so we have a very detailed end result. This is it, guys. This is going to be it for now. I really hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, I really like to know what you think or what your questions are, or you have any suggestions whatsoever. Let me know. This is going to be it for now, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya.